Okay, folks, welcome to another session, our last video lecture of the semester for PHI 331. So this is going to round up our unit on democracy, and we are going to be looking at a paper by Tommy Peto called Why 16-Year-Olds Should Have the Right to Vote. Or, that is, why the voting age should be lowered to 16. That's the precise title. So the basic question here today is expanding on that question we looked at before about if we're going to run our society democratically, what should that society look like? How is a democracy run well going to function? Well, Peto is going to argue that it's going to involve giving more teenagers the right to vote. So let's see where Peto goes with this argument. So here's the plan for today. We are going to consider his straightforward argument in favor of lowering the voting age, and we're also going to consider some possible objections that might be raised against Peto's proposal and some possible replies that he might make. And then at the end, we're going to quickly sum up where we've gotten so far in our unit on democracy. And I should say that even though this is our last video lecture for the semester, you still will have the opportunity to also watch a film called What is Democracy, directed by Astra Taylor. There won't be any supplementary video lecture, but you'll still be able to earn some quiz points and some discussion points for that film. And I will be giving you instructions how to access that movie on Canopy as soon as I can. So here's Tommy Peto, our author for today. He's a PhD candidate at the University of Oxford. A fun fact about him is that he was a co-writer on a musical version of A Theory of Justice by John Rawls, which we looked at earlier in the semester. And some of Peto's research deals with not only questions about politics, but also about children's rights. So here's the basic strategy of the argument that we're going to be thinking about. Peto is going to think about a normative account of political maturity. So the kind of political maturity that it takes to have certain kinds of political rights. And then he's going to further argue that 16-year-olds meet that standard. So, what are we talking about when we talk about political maturity? Well, the main argument that Peto sort of sets up as his foil in this paper is one by Chan and Clayton. And they argue that there is empirical data suggesting that 16 and 17-year-olds, in fact, lack the political maturity that's necessary for voting. So this kind of maturity that you need for voting involves knowledge in your political system, and it also involves a certain kind of consistent set of political convictions. So your convictions can't be arbitrary or subject to sudden change, right? So we might think of this as a moderately epistocratic standard of political maturity. The thought is, once you hit a certain age, you'll be likely to have enough knowledge of the political system, enough ability to reason about politics, and you'll have at least a somewhat consistent or stable set of political convictions. And for the sake of argument, even though there are other theories of political rights and political maturity that might focus on things like autonomy and rationality instead of things like autonomy, Peto is going to grant this standard for the sake of argument. So, what happens in Chan and Clayton's article? Well, they looked at some data from both British election studies as well as the British Social Attitudes Survey. So the Social Attitudes Survey looked at people ages 12 through 19, and the British Election Studies Survey looked at people 18 plus. And what they found was that on 4 questions, 40% of 16 and 17-year-olds got them all right. And then there was a gradual increase in getting them right up until age 50, where people were hitting 70 to 80%. Now, in this case, what we're doing is we're compiling together 2 studies, right? So the info about the 16 and 17-year-olds came from the 98 study, and the one about the 50-year-olds came from 1997, of course. So on this basis, Chan and Clayton are basically saying that minors are going to lack the political knowledge that's necessary for participating in a democracy. So how does Peto respond to this sort of empirically grounded argument that, look, you need to have a certain amount of knowledge, a certain amount of ability to reason from what you know, and you need to have some consistent political convictions? It might seem that this data does seem to show that maybe you're just not there yet at ages 16 and 17. Well, here's how Peto responds. So we'll get to some of Peto's empirical quibbles about Chan and Clayton's study in just a moment. But here's one way that we can sort of think about this approach philosophically, is we can point out that we have 4 options when we consider how to respond to the fact that 16 and 17-year-olds lack political knowledge. Well, we can not give them the political education that they need and deny them the vote. That's sort of like the status quo that Chan and Clayton are arguing in favor of. Or we could leave them at the same level of education and give them the vote. And that's what they seem to be arguing against. But, if we think about these 2 possibilities and how we can fit all of them logically together, we could also give 16 and 17-year-olds an adequate political education and then give them the right to vote. Or we could provide a political education but deny 16-year-olds the vote. Now, number 4 makes the least amount of sense, but here's what Peto points out. He says, even if you prefer 1 over 2, even if you prefer denying 16-year-olds the vote to giving them the vote, Peto says we could still argue, and there's still good reason to think that 3 would be even better than 2 or 1. So the best case scenario would be to make 16 and 17-year-olds adequately educated and then allow them to participate in our democracy. So the idea here is that denying those the right to vote, if they are qualified and deserve it, well, that's a certain kind of injustice, right? And this should be familiar. This is actually really similar to the qualified acceptability argument that Jason Brennan appealed to in his arguments for epistocracy. And we'll notice that basically, Brennan's argument there was that because of the qualified acceptability requirement, one thing that will not make sense about our democracy is that many qualified minors and children will be not allowed to vote. And that's a certain kind of injustice, right? The way that Peto is thinking about it is we should make as many people qualified as possible to vote and then protect that right. And that's why option 3 on this list of possibilities, according to Peto, is the most appealing. So this brings us to a larger thought about knowledge requirements. Peto points out that knowledge requirements for voting rights have to be reasonable, right? We can't set the bar so high that almost nobody is able to participate in a democracy. And we wouldn't want to set the bar so high that most adults, or that very many adults, would be kept from voting. So if we set a standard that's so high that all 16-year-olds aren't going to make it, most adults won't either, right? And Peto points out that 16 and 17-year-olds have a lot of knowledge, and they're perfectly capable of means and reasoning, and they're perfectly capable of logical computations as well. So, as Peto puts it, the sorts of knowledge that most adults have that makes them qualified for voting is, as Peto puts it, well within the grasp of teenagers. So we might look at it in terms of this kind of argument. If it's possible, we should provide an education and give teenagers a right to vote. It is possible to do that, right? It is possible to teach any reasonable knowledge requirement to teenagers. Therefore, we have a requirement, we might think a requirement of justice, to get that education to teenagers and then give them the right to vote. Now, I said earlier that we were going to look into some of Peto's challenges to the empirical considerations that Chan and Clayton looked at. So one thing that Peto points out is that this research that said that 16 and 17-year-olds are less qualified is based on a separate study. So it's comparing the results of two different surveys. And as he points out, the only age group that is looked at on both surveys is 18-year-olds. Because the first survey was, let's check my notes here. So the first survey covered 18 plus, and the other one covered 12 to 19. As Peto points out, the 18-year-olds were doing worse on the survey that counted the 12 through 19-year-olds. So we might have a skewed study, or for some reason, the 16 and 17-year-olds were doing worse, not because of anything intrinsic about them, but because the study made them do worse, or measured them more strictly in a tougher way. Moreover, Peto also appeals to empirical work by Hardin Aikens, saying that civic knowledge increases the most between 14 and 16, and increases little thereafter. So when it comes to knowing how your parliament and how your government actually works, how our voting systems are structured, most of that knowledge increase stops by the time you're 16. And he's also pointed out in that research that 16-year-olds are actually going to score higher than 19-year-olds, 21-year-olds, and 23-year-olds in average tests of civic knowledge. Uh, we also had this charge from Chan and Clayton that young people have whimsical preferences, right? So that they might vote for, I don't know, like their favorite musician or athlete, or that their political convictions, what little there are, aren't very stable. So Peto points out here that to the extent that there are whimsical preferences among teenagers, this is not really anything intrinsic to teenagers. It's more a matter of society being set up in a way that excludes them. And when teenagers are excluded from society, they aren't going to form strong opinions or participate in the political process. Chan and Clayton also pointed out that teens are less partisan. So one line of reply that Peto makes is to point out that, well, maybe this lack of partisanship is because they've been excluded from the political system, right? Why join a political party if your contributions aren't actually valued? Another point that he raises is that maybe the fact that teenagers are less partisan is actually a perfectly good thing, right? Whereas older voters are more set in their ways about which parties and policies they favor, we might have a more thoughtful and open-minded consideration of the issues from teenagers. All right, here's yet another point. It's the thought that, well, we shouldn't let teenagers vote because they are apathetic, right? Apathetic, meaning that, teenagers just don't care, right? They are more concerned with their friends or other social activities than questions about politics. Well, again, Peto is going to point out here that apathy can really be seen and interpreted as the product of an exclusionary system rather than a fact that's intrinsic to teenagers and one that we can use in all circumstances for excluding them. And once we get into this sort of situation where we're deciding about general policy, we want to start thinking about it in terms of a balance of harms, right? So the way that Peto thinks about it is, what's worse, permitting incapable teenagers from voting? Or is it worse to deny the vote to capable teenagers? And Peto's suggestion is that letting the capable teenagers vote is more important than keeping teenagers who lack capability off the voter rolls. Especially given that apathy is often measurable in terms of who shows up to vote. And when they measure apathy in terms of how much time a person spends thinking about the election, it's like less than 1 or 2% who will actually eventually turn up to vote. So the problem of apathetic people voting, if it's a problem at all, is a very small one. Here's the way that Peto puts it, and we might even think about this in kind of Rawlsian points, Rawlsian terms, I should say. That if we accept democratic principles in general, then it must be wrong to deny the vote to any particular individual who's competent and whose interests are affected by the government. So, knowledgeable teenagers certainly seem to fall into this category of competency and possession of interests. Now, there might be debatable cases here. People like felons, prisoners, or green card immigrants are often people who are competent and who have an interest in the way that the government does its work. But we might think that it's wrong to let these people vote. So I, for instance, am a Canadian green card immigrant. I do not have U.S. citizenship, and therefore, even though I live and work in the U.S., I don't have the right to vote. And you might think that that's just the right thing, that it should be excluded to citizens. So we might try to ask Peto about how strongly he wants to push this principle, and whether the limits on voting for non-citizens might also be applied to the limits on voting that we place on minors. A further point here is that there are issues that concern young people in particular. So issues concerning education or the environment. We considered Greta Thunberg just briefly by having her on the title card, but we might think that the interest in protecting the environment is a more pressing concern for younger people. And we might also think that cognitive diversity might increase the value of democracy. If you get more perspectives in the room, you might be able to solve a problem better, have a little more accuracy. That was at least the thought behind Condorcet's theorem, which we looked at when we thought about Kraut. Just a couple of closing thoughts. So within the apathy section, Peto also points out that if we deny the vote to teenagers, either we're denying that they have equal standing as members of society, or we're going to fail to respect them as autonomous individuals. He points out that this lack of interest that a lot of teenagers express is going to be largely explained by the fact that interest is going to be lower when politicians are not actively seeking your support. There's research that says that when politicians reach out to contact you during a campaign, that increases your likelihood of voting by about 3 or 4 times. Peto also points to some empirical studies. So Austria and Norway, who have given the vote to 16-year-olds, these countries have shown that teens are going to participate in politics at the same rate once they're given the vote. So the thought here is that young people, if given more democratic rights, might rise to the occasion, as it were. So here's just a couple closing possible objections. Now, these are not in Peto's paper. So if you're impressed with Peto's argument so far, you might try to come up with answers to these questions, or you might see if maybe these objections, as I've laid them out, might still be missing something about your objections to giving 16 and 17-year-olds the right to vote. So one is that we don't give teenagers the same rights in terms of voting because teenagers don't have the same responsibilities. So this wasn't mentioned by Peto, but we can think about the history of the voting age in the United States. And one thing that we found there was that a big reason why the voting age was lowered in the U.S. is because during the Vietnam War, there were 18-year-olds being drafted, right? So there it became especially pressing to notice that the interests of young people were ones that were maybe strong enough to give these 18, 19, and 20-year-olds the right to vote. But the thought here is that if you're old enough to fight in a war, you're old enough to vote, right? Now, I don't quite accept the thought that with every right comes a responsibility. One reason we might notice that is if we agree with Elizabeth Anderson's view that some rights are inalienable, and you have these rights no matter how intelligently or unintelligently you act in society. But moreover, we noticed in Simmons's paper that liberty rights don't place obligations on others. So it's not quite true that with every right comes a responsibility. But it seems like that line of reasoning might have been persuasive to many Americans in the 1970s when the voting age was lowered to 18. Here's another way of putting it. An important part of acknowledging the rights of children involves noticing the ways in which children are different from adults. So children have the right to, have food and shelter provided for them in ways that adults don't. And this is partly explained by the fact that, maybe wholly explained by the fact that children aren't able to fend for themselves. And when we start thinking about it in these terms, we might start to think that voting rights aren't the sorts of things that you should acquire until you're considered a full citizen. Say, also subject to the same kinds of legal penalties that all adults are subject to. There's also an objection that the brains of young people aren't fully developed. So even though young people are fully capable of logic and means-end reasoning, by the time they're 14 or 15, we might think that certain decision-making features of the prefrontal cortex are not fully there, and a lot of studies have suggested until you're age 25. Now, Peto might just point out that just because you don't have a fully developed frontal lobe that deals with things like impulse control, you're still able to reason and make autonomous decisions. And in that sense, Peto is still going to insist and appeal to good research that suggests that the cognitive abilities of 16-year-olds and adults is basically identical. One final consideration is the thought that a voting age cutoff of 18 is fair because it applies to everyone equally. Everybody can vote once they're 18. In a similar way that, everybody can apply for a driver's license only once they're 16. Well, that's not, in particular, unfair to any particular 15-year-old, because you just tell them, well, it's the same rules for everybody, buddy. You gotta just wait for a year. So that'll do it for our discussion of Tommy Peto. Just to sum up some of the big moves in our unit on democracy. So prior to the unit itself, we saw in Hobbes and Simmons that we have a need for a stable sovereign, and we need to have consent of those who are governed. Now, Hobbes pointed out that maybe a monarchy would actually be a better way of establishing a sovereign than a democracy. But when we moved on to our unit on democracy, we saw critics of democracy, writers like Plato, Richard Kraut, and Jason Brennan, who basically suggested that only the most knowledgeable should have the right to vote. And in this sense, we should disfavor democracy and prefer what Plato would call an aristocracy, what Brennan called epistocracy, right? Rule by the wisest, basically. But we also saw some defenses of democracy, right? So in Dewey and James, their suggestion was democracy has a certain way of showing adequate respect for every member of a society. And moreover, they thought that there's something about democracy that brings out the best in people. Now, Peto's argument that we should give as many people the vote after giving a proper education to as many as can receive it is kind of similar to these Deweyan and Jamesian arguments. We then saw the debate on mandatory voting. So Birch came out in favor of it, that it would bring about good results and involves no significant rights violations, whereas Lever argued that these good results might be kind of tenuous, and that the rights violations involved might not be so insignificant as Birch makes it out. And then today, we saw Peto arguing that we should allow 16 and 17-year-olds a right to vote because they're mature enough, and because, to a large extent, if there is incompetency among 16 and 17-year-olds, it's because they've been excluded from the system. So that'll do it for today. Thanks for listening in. And like always, even once this course is over, don't hesitate to reach out by sending an email, because I'd always love to help you think through a philosophical question, or to offer any of my thoughts or advice that I can. So thanks for listening in, and I'll hear from you soon. All right, bye.